So let's recall the situation as it stands in the United States, especially in the American South, for Black Americans. The law of the land continues to be Plessy v. Ferguson, a Supreme Court decision handed down in 1896, which said that it is not a violation of the 14th Amendment to discriminate against a person on the basis of race, so long as you are providing separate but equal accommodations. And the dots that you see before you there in the American South are all of the states in the United States with Jim Crow laws. Those are laws that are going to discriminate based on race, calling attention to the separate but equal doctrine. Now, in the South, this is enforced by law. In the North, things aren't always that much better. They're enforced by tradition. So by law, we say segregation de jure, and segregation by tradition is called de facto segregation. Let's look at how far we've come. Some of the early civil rights leaders, starting with Ida B. Wells. You recall that during the Progressive era, she wrote extensively against the practice of lynching and was modestly successful in getting Congress to pass stronger anti-lynching laws. You also have Booker T. Washington. And you'll recall he established the Tuskegee Institute, also in the American Progressive era, in which he worked to uplift Black people to economic self-sufficiency. But Booker T. Washington did not want to agitate directly for civil rights. He did not want to pursue civil rights in court. W.E.B. Du Bois, on the other hand, most certainly did. He's a Black academic, the first Black man to graduate with a Ph.D. from Harvard University, and together with Ida B. Wells, he established the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And their tactic was to pursue civil rights for Black people through litigation, that is, through the court system, overturning one by one racist laws. We also have Marcus Garvey, who, in the 1920s, brought about a different kind of civil rights movement. He was a militant Black nationalist who led a Back to Africa movement, calling for his followers to give up on the United States and basically go back to Africa and found a Black republic there. He wasn't very successful, but nevertheless he stands out as somebody who sought to correct some of the wrongs that we saw in American life. Of course, you recall A. Philip Randolph, who pressured FDR during the Second World War to pass anti-discriminatory laws in defense industries. And he threatened to march on Washington, and FDR didn't want any part of that. And so FDR issues an executive order doing what A. Philip Randolph has asked. Well, even as we look at these leaders and we admire their perseverance, we must bear in mind that there has been no significant civil rights legislation passed in the U.S. Congress since legislation. That's a really long time. In the post-war era, popular attitudes about race and about popular racism begin to change. And one of the reasons for this is the liberation of the Nazi death camps by the Allied forces in 1945. When Americans see pictures of where racism can lead in its most extreme and virulent form, it makes a lot of Americans uncomfortable with the casual racism that is still okay with regards to Jews, Japanese, and other minorities in the United States. And another thing that confounds Americans and makes them rethink some of their attitudes about race is the bravery and the skill and the courage of the Tuskegee Airmen who, as you recall, flew many missions to protect American bombers during World War II, and they never lost a single man. And so Americans begin to rethink popular assumptions about Black soldiers, and then by extension, about Black people in general. Well, race relations in the 1940s are going to begin a very slow, but nevertheless very deliberate creep forward. James Farmer and other civil rights leaders formed an organization called CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, in 1942. And we're going to see them become increasingly active throughout the 1950s and the 1960s. Gunnar Myrdal published a book called An American Dilemma in 1944 And this is significant because it's the first mainstream work that is going to be read by both white people and black people on race relations in the United States. But for a lot of Americans, the color line becomes increasingly apparent when they see Jackie Robinson join the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947, becoming the first black American in Major League Baseball. He dealt with very rough treatment and death threats, even from other members of the Major League. He says, "I'm not concerned with your liking or disliking me. All I ask is that you respect me as a human being." And so Jackie Robinson, along with another player, a Cuban-American named Roberto Clemente, begin to challenge popular assumptions about segregation in popular sports. Following the Second World War, President Truman wanted the federal government to take stronger action against racial discrimination. You'll recall that the last civil rights legislation of major consequence was the 15th Amendment passed in 1868, which gave black men the right to vote. Harry Truman then establishes the first Civil Rights Commission since that time to investigate the issues related to segregation. His proposal is called To Secure These Rights, and what he asks for are truly revolutionary suggestions. He wants to end poll taxes. He wants to desegregate the military. He wants to provide for health care. He wants to provide for better education. And this one, he wants to end racial segregation in all public accommodations, is by far the most sweeping part of To Secure These Rights. To Secure These Rights reads, "This concept of equality, which is so vital a part of the American heritage, knows no kinship with notions of human uniformity or regimentation. We abhor the totalitarian arrogance which makes one man say that he will respect another man as his equal only if he has my race, my religion, my political views, my social position. In our land, men are equal, but they are free to be different. From these very differences among our people has come the great human and national strength of America." Well, Congress fails to pass To Secure These Rights, primarily because the Southern Democratic representatives in the House are going to oppose it. Well, President Truman is no stranger to tough calls. You recall that in 1946, when the Republicans gained control of the House and the Senate, he privately told his wife, "I'm going to do as I damn well please for the next 2 years, and to hell with all of them." Well, Harry Truman is going to take that same attitude when it comes to civil rights. Right over Congress's head, he issues Executive Order 9981, which desegregates the military by executive order in 1947. Now, Harry Truman has just created a problem for himself, and he's created a problem for the Democrats, because 1948 is an election year. What has he just done? You recall that the Solid South has been loyal to the Democratic Party since the end of the Civil War. Will the Solid South stay with the Democratic Party, who has now a president who's wiped out segregation in the armed forces and even called for the end of Jim Crow? Well, the Democratic Party's official platform of 1948 endorses the president and his civil rights call. The Democratic Party commits itself to continuing its efforts to eradicate all racial, religious, and economic discrimination. We again state our belief that racial and religious minorities must have the right to live, the right to work, the right to vote, the full and equal protection of the laws on a basis of equality with all citizens as guaranteed by the Constitution. And then the Democratic Party says this: "We highly commend President Harry S. Truman for his courageous stand on the issue of civil rights. We call upon Congress to support our president in guaranteeing these basic and fundamental American principles. 1. The right of full and equal political participation. 2. The right to equal opportunity of employment. And 3. The right of security of person. And 4. The right of equal treatment in the service and defense of our nation." Harry Truman had so fractured the Democratic Party with his civil rights message in 1947 that a movement developed within the party to drop Truman from the ticket in 1948 and draft the hero of D-Day, Dwight D. Eisenhower, as their presidential candidate. The Democrats are just mild about Harry, so the saying said. Well, Ike agreed at first, but then declined at the last minute, saying that he would rather go and try his luck as a university president than president of the United States. So, much to some people's disappointment in the Democratic Party, they're stuck with the hand-me-down president, Harry S. Truman, as the frontrunner of the Democratic Party, believing there's no way he can win. The Republicans drafted New York Governor Thomas Dewey, who swings far more to the right than the Republicans have done since the 20s. He beats up on the president as high-tax Harry and criticizes his fair deal and the extension of the welfare state that he proposes. And he threw support behind even tougher policies with the Soviet Union, and he supports anti-union policies like the Taft-Hartley bill. Well, going into 1948, it really looks hopeless for the Democrats because they're going to end up dividing three ways. One wing of the party still supports the Democratic frontrunner and the incumbent president, Harry Truman, who stands on containment, on the civil rights deal, and what he calls the fair deal are going to be the main platform for the Democrats. You've got another wing of the Democratic Party who thinks that Truman isn't going far enough with social reform. This is the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. They want a softer position toward the Soviets, and they want a massive extension of the welfare state. They want to continue and expand the New Deal. Now, the other part of the Democratic Party that's fracturing and splitting away is led by Strom Thurmond in what he calls the States' Rights Party. Now, this is a single-issue third party, and they split from the Democrats over the civil rights platform of 1947. So here you see the campaign poster for the States' Rights Party in 1948. Strom Thurmond is their front runner, and they're also known as the Dixiecrats. The single issue on which they campaign is a maintenance of the racial status quo in the South. They want the federal government to stay out of race relations in the South. Believe it or not, against all odds, Harry Truman comes out ahead and wins the presidency for the United States. You can see him there holding up the pre-printed newspaper headline saying Dewey defeats Truman, when in fact the reverse was true. But it's an interesting election for a number of reasons. The first is that a party that was divided three ways actually won. This never happens. Usually when you get a third party in American politics, it splits the party that it's most closest to, or the party from which it emerged, and the other party is the one that wins. This wasn't the case in 1948. The other thing you need to look at is the part of the country that this third party broke apart. The third party broke apart the Solid South. That would be the States' Rights Party. This is the first time that the Solid South, or at least 4 states in the Solid South, did not vote Democrat since 1856. So in a number of ways, the election of 1848 is pretty significant. And it shows us that this civil rights issue is really becoming a divisive national issue, and it's an issue for which the southern states are willing to abandon their traditional home in the Democratic Party. And to sweeten the deal for the Democrats, they regain control of both houses of Congress, taking it from the Republicans who had gained the ascendancy in 1946. They're going to gain it again in 1952 for a term, but the Republicans will not control Congress again until the so-called Republican Revolution led by Newt Gingrich in 1994. We remember that the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, had become the largest civil rights organization in the nation by the end of the Second World War in 1945. You remember it was begun by W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells in 1909, And their strategy was to challenge racist laws in court through litigation, law by law, case by case. By 1950, the leading lawyer in the NAACP was a man named Thurgood Marshall, a black American from Baltimore. He has a quote that I think exemplifies his outlook on life. He says, "None of us got where we are solely by pulling us up by our bootstraps. We got here because somebody, a parent, a teacher, an Ivy League crony, or a few nuns, bent down and helped us pick up our boots." Well, a black man named Herman Sweat applied to the University of Texas Law School in 1948. He was accepted, but then he was rejected because UT learned that he was black, and UT does not accept integrated education. So Sweat took his case to Marshall and the NAACP. And in what becomes Sweat v. Painter in 1950, the Supreme Court is going to decide the fate of Herman Sweat and the University of Texas. The argument is that because UT does not have a separate law school for black students, it does not, therefore, fulfill the separate but equal requirement of Plessy v. Ferguson. So, therefore, UT is in violation of the 14th Amendment, which says that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. That's the 14th Amendment. And Texas is a state-funded school. So the University of Texas's solution is to create, in a sense, a separate law school just to keep Sweat out. The court ruled that this new school was in fact inferior and did not satisfy the Plessy requirement. As you can see, they didn't really create anything. What they did was they put Herman Sweat in the hall and called it a new school. So the court ruled that UT had to let Sweat in, or they had to actually build an equal black law school. So the result of Sweat v. Painter, 1950, is that Herman Sweat wins, and Texas has to integrate its law school. That is, if they don't feel like building a whole new law school that's separate and equal. The second case we're going to look at involves an elementary school child named Linda Brown. Linda Brown lives in Kansas, and she attends an all-black segregated public school. Now, in order to get to this all-black segregated public school, Linda Brown has to cross over a railroad track, probably not very safe for a 9-year-old. She also has to cross through a construction site, also probably not a very safe environment for an elementary school child to be walking through. And altogether, she's got to travel 7 miles on foot just to attend her separate and supposedly equal public school. Well, her dad decides to apply for admission to an all-white school in 1953 on the grounds that the school she has to go to is inferior and therefore not equal. Definitely separate, but not equal. The case catches the attention of Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP. And they collectively, Brown and a lot of other black families in the Topeka area, decide that they're going to take their case to the Supreme Court. And so the stage is set for Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. Well, in the case of Brown v. Board of Education, Thurgood Marshall argues that segregated public schools deny black students equal protection of the law that is promised to them under the 14th Amendment. You remember, this is the same line of reasoning that he used in the Sweat v. Painter case. Therefore, says Marshall, the education that black students receive is inherently unequal to that of white students, and therefore there can be no such thing as separate but equal. Notice what is happening here. He's not just going for a small concession. He's not just trying to get one kid or a group of kids into one segregated school. What he's trying to do is challenge the entire doctrine of separate but equal. Well, the case goes before the Warren Court, and it's so named for the Chief Justice Earl Warren. They're probably the most liberal court that the United States has ever seen. And the Warren Court, led by Earl Warren, agrees. They say, does the segregation of children in public schools solely on the basis of race deprive children of the minority group equal education opportunities? We believe that it does. In the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. And so when the Supreme Court voted on this decision, they come up with a unanimous decision. So there is Linda Brown sitting on the steps of the Supreme Court, enjoying her victory. Court bans segregation in public school cases. Well, as you can imagine, this decision is not well received by everybody. A group of Southern congressmen and senators in 1956 issue what is known as the Southern Manifesto. It reads, "This unwarranted exercise of power by the court, contrary to the Constitution, is creating chaos and confusion in the states principally affected. It is destroying the amicable relations between the white and Negro races that have been created through 90 years of patient effort by the good people of both races. It has planted hatred and suspicion where there has been heretofore friendship and understanding. We decry the Supreme Court's encroachments on the rights reserved to the states and to the people, contrary to established law and to the Constitution. We pledge ourselves to use all lawful means to bring about a reversal of this decision, which is contrary to the Constitution, and to prevent the use of force in its implementation." And it is signed by 19 senators and 77 congressmen who pledge, as they say, to use all lawful means to reverse the Brown decision. One of the loose ends in the Brown decision is the language that the Warren Court used to mandate the desegregation of public schools. It said that this should happen with all deliberate speed. Note, this doesn't actually set any kind of realistic timeline for when this should happen. It just says all deliberate speed. So if I told you we're all gonna have our homework done in all deliberate speed, or we're gonna take this test with all deliberate speed, that really wouldn't tell you a whole lot. And so as you can see by this map here, it charts the desegregation, the progress of desegregation in the South from 1954 to 1974. And look at where the states are that are having the toughest time following the court's mandate. Places like Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. By 1964, those states have 0 to 1% of its African American students in schools with whites. Look at us in Texas. We're doing a little bit better at 5.5%. Texas usually stands apart in some degree from the so-called solid South, but look at Mississippi, 0.0%. Alabama, 0.007%. We're not really making a whole lot of progress in the first 10 years following Brown. Another way to gauge progress toward desegregation in the 10 years following the Brown decision is to look at state expenditures per pupil. Alabama, just to start at the top, $34.25 on average per white pupil, and around $12 on average for its black pupils. Mississippi, the state that had absolutely no progress in the 10 years toward after the Brown decision, is spending $31.33 on each white pupil and $6.64 on average for each black pupil. Absolutely appalling, if you ask me. Texas, if we can highlight our own state, $53.09 on each white pupil, and that is actually pretty high, just under Florida and Mississippi. And we are spending $29.36 per black pupil. So you can generalize from this and know the states are not, the South is not making very good progress toward desegregation or in equalizing the amount of monetary attention that black and white students are receiving. Well, let's look at the Brown decision in the long view. Let's take a look at the number of Black Americans completing 4 or more years of high school. That was pretty bad in 1960. Only about 20% of Black Americans had 4 or more years of high school. In 1970, that jumps to around 31. By 1980, you're just over half of Black Americans completing 4 or more years of high school. By 1990, it's 66.2%, and in 2000, 78.5%. There we are right around this time. This is 2010, where we have 84.2% of Black Americans completing 4 or more years of high school. So as you can see, progress is being made. Another way of looking at this is to see how many Black Americans are completing 4 or more years of college. In 1960, it was almost nobody, 3.1%. 1970, that jumps just slightly to 4.4%, and then again we double in 1980, so significant improvement being made. By 1990, 11.3, 2000, 16.5, and you've got around 19.8% of Black Americans completing 4 or more years of college in 2010. So we've made progress, considering that about 25% of the population as a whole completes 4 or more years of college. This is where Black Americans stand. We're looking at Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. Little Rock had a plan to gradually comply with the Brown decision. They were to begin with their flagship school, Central High School. 9 Black kids registered to be among the first integrated students at Central High, and they're known as the Little Rock Nine in 1957. Now, the Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus announced his opposition to the Brown decision, and he called for the Arkansas State Troops, the Arkansas National Guard, to surround the high school and prevent the Little Rock Nine from gaining entrance. And there's a picture of Orville Faubus making his declaration against the Brown decision, saying that the Arkansas schools will not be integrated. Notice the presence of the Confederate flag. And that is Elizabeth Eckford, trying to gain entrance into Central High School in the fall of 1957. She recalls, "All around me I heard the cry of the mob. Someone called out, 'Lynch her, lynch her.' I looked into the face of an old woman, and it seemed a kind face. But when I looked again, she spat on me." And the Little Rock Nine did not gain entrance into the school that day. President Eisenhower had personal misgivings about the Brown decision. Brown had upset the customs and convictions of at least 2 generations of Americans. I do not believe that prejudices, even palpably unjustifiable prejudices, will succumb to compulsion. So Eisenhower does not believe that the Brown decision was good. He believes that it's really too much too soon, and that it's going to do more to hurt relations between blacks and whites in the South than it will to help them. Nevertheless, the Arkansas State Troops are defying a federal court order, and Eisenhower believes this is tantamount to treason. And so what Ike does is he sends the order to nationalize the Arkansas State Troops. This essentially says, you guys are working for the federal government now. I'm the commander-in-chief, and I'll be issuing your orders from this point forward. And then he calls in the 101st Airborne, which are additional federal troops, and he's telling them that they are going to enforce the Brown decision with force if necessary. And there are the federal troops, the 101st Airborne, essentially invading Little Rock, Arkansas, in order to force the city to comply with the Supreme Court decision. And there you have the federal troops protecting the Little Rock Nine as they're gaining entrance to the school for the very first time. Eisenhower said, "It is important that the reasons for my actions be understood by all our citizens. A foundation of our American way of life is our national respect for the law. If resistance to the federal court order ceases at once, the further presence of federal troops will be unnecessary, and the city of Little Rock will return to its normal habits of peace and order, and a blot upon the fair name of high honor in our nation and the world will be removed. Well, in the city of Montgomery, Alabama, on December 1st, 1955, a black American named Rosa Parks, a seamstress from Montgomery, boarded a bus on her way home. When a white passenger demanded her seat, you see she had sat in the whites only section, she refused to give it up. And so Parks was arrested for violating the city's segregation laws. The policeman asked if the driver had asked me to stand up, and I said yes, and they wanted to know why I didn't. I told them I didn't think I should have to stand up. After I had paid my fare and occupied a seat, I didn't think I should have to give it up. Contrary to some of the popular mythology that surrounds the Montgomery Bus Boycott, Rosa Parks' arrest was not a random, unplanned event, and Parks was not just tired. She had been riding buses for weeks, trying to provoke a response. She was trying to get arrested because, you see, Parks was a member of the Montgomery NAACP, which operated out of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery. She was trying to get arrested so that she had a reason for the NAACP to take this law to court and hopefully get it overturned. Now, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, as we all know, had a soon-to-be famous pastor, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And King is going to emerge as the leader of the Montgomery Bus Boycott and then later the civil rights movement in general. He calls on the black community to continue to resist the racist bus laws in Montgomery. And this launches the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And so you can see the empty buses. That's because black people are not riding them. King calls for a complete boycott of the Montgomery city buses until they reverse their discriminatory policies. It's to hit them in the pocketbook. If black people aren't riding and black people are the majority of the bus's customers, they will not have the funds to continue to operate and the city will lose money. He asked the protesters to be patient, to be firm, and above all, to be nonviolent. Violence, he says, will only sow bitterness and hatred and will make future relationships between blacks and whites difficult. So it is important that as we protest unjust laws, we remain nonviolent. The Montgomery Bus Boycott lasted 381 days until a state court declared segregation on buses unconstitutional. Most black residents participated. They carpooled. They took long walks and took any other means of transportation that were available to them. But they stayed off the buses to see this through. A group of black citizens of Montgomery taking to the streets and walking to work. The Reverend Joseph Lowry, who was a Methodist minister, recalls, "You see, what the bus thing did was simply more than withholding patronage from the bus. It was restoring a sense of dignity to the patrons, as best expressed by an oft-quoted black woman in Montgomery who said, 'Since I've been walking, my feet are tired, but my soul's rested.' Prior to the bus boycotts, the determination of our freedom rested with the courts. With the bus boycott, we determined it. The court could say what it liked. We weren't going to ride in the back of the bus. We'd walk." Well, following the Montgomery Bus Boycott, the civil rights movement took two complementary but distinct courses. The group that was leading the boycott was the Montgomery Improvement Associations, or the MIA, which was led by Dr. Martin Luther King and Ralph David Abernathy. Now it splinters into the group that led the boycott into what's called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1957, the SCLC, and that was led by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Another group, which is primarily made up of college students, black college students from the South, is called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and it's often pronounced SNCC. And this is organized by a woman named Ella Baker, and it had a much more diverse leadership. Let's talk about the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. King was above all things a Baptist pastor. He was theologically trained and he was biblically educated. His ideas about nonviolence and love for enemies are straight from the teachings of Jesus in the New Testament. King was also deeply read in the works of Henry David Thoreau, who's the transcendentalist writer from the 19th century, perhaps most famous for On Civil Disobedience, in which he argued that an unjust law is no law at all and should be broken. Also, King looked to the inspiration of Mohandas Gandhi, whose nonviolent protest against British rule in India proved to be King's greatest practical inspiration. King once said, "Jesus showed us the way. Gandhi showed us it could work." Unlike some of the other people who are going to assume leadership in the civil rights movement, such as Malcolm X, King is not a black nationalist. He is not for black superiority, and he's not for black separatism. King is for integration. He believes blacks and whites should live together as equals. He believes in something called the beloved community. That's a reconciled community in which members acted in a Christ-like way toward every other member. He puts it this way: the end, that is, the end of the struggle, the movement, is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opponents into friends. It is this type of understanding, goodwill, that will transform the deep gloom of the old age into the exuberant gladness of the new age. It is this love which will bring about miracles in the hearts of men. And of nonviolence, why will King not use force to achieve his goals? Violence may win the war, says King, but it will not win the peace. Violence will not sow friendship, but it will only bring about bitterness. It is not a foundation from which King hopes to build the beloved community. He says nonviolence is the answer to the crucial political and moral questions of our time. The need for man to overcome oppression and violence without resorting to violence and oppression. I believe that even amid today's mortar bursts and whining bullets, there is still hope for a brighter tomorrow. I still believe that one day mankind will bow before the altars of God and be crowned triumphant over war and bloodshed, and every man shall sit under his own vine and fig tree, and none shall be afraid. Well, King quickly rose to become the de facto leader of a nationwide movement to abolish segregation and Jim Crow. In Greensboro, Alabama, for example, in 1960, 4 college students began a sit-in at a Woolworth's lunch counter. As expected, they were refused service, and the restaurant patrons grew violent. The sit-in movement grew to include both blacks and whites, and eventually became wade-ins in public pools and read-ins at public libraries. The Interstate Highway Act of 1956 had created a system of roads that had linked the nation as never before. And so a question is, what about state segregation laws? Did they apply? Well, Boynton v. Virginia said, no, the interstate highways are under federal control and the Constitution's Commerce Clause, and therefore are not subject to state laws. So, on the federal highways, there will be no racial segregation. Well, a group called CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, which was formed in the 1940s, basically says, prove it. And they ask the question, will the federal government support citizens who openly break segregation laws in bus stations and rest stops and other places that fall along the domain of the Interstate Highway Act? And so they organized in 1961 what is known as the Freedom Rides throughout the South. Black and white riders are going to get on buses and they're going to travel through the segregated South and they're going to openly break segregation laws wherever they found them. The Freedom Riders' goal is to travel southward from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans, all the while openly breaking segregation laws in hopes of provoking a response and testing the federal government's resolve to keep the interstate highways desegregated. So they're going to start in May of 1961 with 2 buses in Washington, D.C. They're going to pass through Greensboro, North Carolina without incident. But by the time they get to Anniston, Georgia on May 14th, pro-segregationists drag them off of the bus and bomb it. The second bus continues on to Birmingham, Alabama. But by May 20, the bus comes into the city and meets an angry mob, in which several of the Freedom Riders are pulled off of the bus and beaten. They get back on the bus and can travel just southward to Montgomery, Alabama, where again an angry group of pro-segregationists this time stop them, and they pull the Freedom Riders off of the bus and beat them senseless. Now the question is, what kind of response is going to come from the federal government? Because remember, they had promised that the interstate highways fall under federal control and are therefore desegregated. Well, John F. Kennedy is a Massachusetts Democrat. He's also an Irish-American Roman Catholic. And he was elected in 1960 with the narrowest margin in history. In fact, 2 of the electors in Mississippi and Alabama actually seceded from the Democratic Party and voted for Harry F. Byrd, a conservative Democrat who had not even pledged to run. So what is Kennedy supposed to do? He's in a very awkward position. In his 1960 campaign, he had promised to end segregation, quote, with the stroke of a pen. But if he openly supports the Freedom Riders, then he's likely to be the first Democrat to completely lose the Solid South. So what do? How about a quid pro quo? Kennedy, in his perhaps less than bright shining moment, says this. He tells the Freedom Riders that he will send federal protection for the rest of their journey, and so they'll be able to complete their freedom ride, breaking segregation laws wherever they go, and the federal government will protect them. Now, on the other hand, he privately tells Mississippi leaders that he will not intervene when the Freedom Riders are arrested for, how about disturbing the peace? And so you can see the federal troops protecting the Freedom Riders as they complete their ride through the South in May of 1961. And when they're done with their ride, here are their arrest photos as pro-segregationist authorities arrest them for disturbing the peace. Well, once again, the question of civil rights centers around public education. When in 1961, an Air Force veteran by the name of James Meredith applied to the famous all-white University of Mississippi, known as Ole Miss. And of course, he was denied on account of his race. Now, Meredith expected this to happen, and so he wrote directly to Thurgood Marshall of the NAACP asking them to intervene. In the letter, Meredith wrote that he knew that the probable difficulties involved in such a move as I am undertaking, and I am fully prepared to pursue it all the way. So the NAACP agreed to provide Meredith with legal representation, and of course, they win in 1962, and the courts order Ole Miss to desegregate and let Meredith in. But this struggle is far from over. The students at Ole Miss riot in the streets, fly the stars and bars, and swear that they will never let James Meredith register for classes. Here they are again. You can see him raising the stars and bars high and swearing that they will never follow the court's order to desegregate. Again, President Kennedy was forced to intervene by sending in federal marshals and the military police to escort James Meredith to and from classes for his own protection. When Meredith arrives in his classes, he finds that many of the white students, upon learning of his registration, have dropped the course. Now, to the credit of many of the professors, they refuse to cancel classes and continue to teach it with only 2 or 3 students enrolled. So in the end, President Kennedy was forced to send in 400 federal marshals and 3,000 troops to enforce the enrollment of Meredith in his first class, which was in colonial American history. Meredith ultimately graduated with a sheepskin that cost the lives of 2 men, scores of injuries, and roughly $4 million taxpayer dollars. Martin Luther King's next move is to target Birmingham, Alabama, which is known as the most segregated city in the South. King and SCLC are planning a nonviolent protest march against the local segregation laws. City officials, knowing that King is coming and realizing what he has in mind, refuse SCLC a marching permit. King also realizes this would happen, and so decides that he's going to march anyway, and sets out on Good Friday, 1963. Well, of course, King does not get too far before he's arrested for breaking a local city ordinance and he's tossed in jail. And there, from Birmingham Jail, King will set his pen to work, writing the most forceful and muscular defense of his nonviolent protest and his willing to break segregation laws, the letter from Birmingham Jail. He begins, "My dear fellow clergymen, I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the prophets of the 8th century BC left their villages and carried their 'Thus saith the Lord' far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the Apostle Paul left his village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to the far corners of the Greco-Roman world, so am I compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid." King is writing to a group of Christian ministers who have criticized him for his nonviolent tactics and especially for his willingness to break established laws. He compares his mission to that of St. Paul, who penned much of the letters in the New Testament, and he will go where God compels him to go. "Wherever there is injustice, there I will be," says Martin Luther King. King continues, "One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are 2 types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all." And so King wants obedience to some laws that he believes are just. That would be like the Brown decision. But he calls for disobedience to others, segregation laws. In fact, he says we have a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. How is this? One must obey laws that are just and disobey laws that are unjust. How do you tell the difference? A just law agrees with the eternal and always just laws of God, and unjust laws do not. Moreover, King continues, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its bounds. And so here, King puts forward the proposition that all human beings are part of the same cosmic community. And a person cannot go about his or her daily routine and not expect actions to have consequences. And so no American who lives within the bounds of the United States can be considered an outsider. What one does affects everyone else. Just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals can rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, so we must see the need for nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help men rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. What King hopes to do is, just as Socrates created an intellectual crisis in the mind and forced people to question their own assumptions, King wants to create a moral crisis within each person that he meets. And so when white people see the violence being inflicted on the nonviolent protesters, King hopes and King believes that it will waken their conscience and permit constructive dialogue. And from there, he wants to build the beloved community. You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. King says that violence only facilitates hatred and resentment and is no foundation from which to build the beloved community. King's vision, King's dream, is about more than just changing laws. When we change those laws, he says, it is about building and creating the beloved community in which everyone coexists as one human family. And if we're going to do that by beating each other over the heads, we are defeating the purpose of that beloved community. Nonviolence, says King, and Christian love is the answer. Well, King's letter from Birmingham Jail appeared in magazines and newspapers across the country. And for many Americans, it was the first time that they had seen the unedited King, the eloquent, the thoughtful, and the morally centered King. Moderate whites came to support SCLC and the civil rights movement in general. And so King knew that he had the nation's attention, and he had to seek that creative tension and seek its ultimate fulfillment and the building of the beloved community. So for King, getting these images on TV was exactly what he wanted. Americans could then see firsthand what the defenders of segregation were willing to do to other human beings. And when they see this, and they see what their current policies are doing, they will face that moral crisis, and they'll be forced to act. Not all Americans were immediately seized by King's moral crisis. George Wallace, the newly elected governor of Alabama, decided to use this occasion to take his stand. He says, "Today I have stood where once Jefferson Davis stood," that would be the former president of the Confederacy, "and took an oath to my people. It is very appropriate, then, that from this cradle of the Confederacy," he's speaking of Montgomery, Alabama, "this very great heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum of freedom, as have our generations of forebears have done, time and time again through history. Let us rise to the call of freedom, loving blood that is in us, and send us answer to the tyranny that clanks its chains upon the South. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." Well, George Wallace is delivering his speech just as two black students, James Hood and Vivian Malone, attempted to register for classes at the University of Alabama, which had recently been ordered by the courts to desegregate. So George Wallace arrives with state troops at the door of the university, and he personally blocks their entrance. He gives a speech. He says, "The unwelcomed, unwanted, unwarranted, and force-induced intrusion upon the campus of the University of Alabama today of the might of the central government offers frightful example of the oppression of the rights, privileges, and sovereignty of this state by officers of the federal government. It is important that the people of this state and nation understand that this action is in violation of the rights reserved to the state by the Constitution of the United States. This is George Wallace's famous speech before the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama. So just as Orville Faubus had done at Central High School in Little Rock in 1957, George Wallace is now taking his stand at the University of Alabama in 1963. And so there's George Wallace at the schoolhouse door with the Alabama National Guard by his side. Vivian Malone, the black student who was attempting to register that day, said, "I didn't feel I should sneak in. I didn't feel I should go around the back door. If Wallace were standing in the door, I had every right to face him and go to school." Once again, President Kennedy is forced to use his executive power, and he issues Presidential Proclamation 3542, which ordered the governor to comply and authorized the Secretary of Defense to federalize the Alabama National Guard with an executive order. And so the Alabama National Guard obeys their commander-in-chief, just as the Arkansas National Guard had also obeyed Eisenhower back in 1957. And so Wallace, knowing he'd been beat and knowing he'd been bested, stepped aside rather than start the next Civil War. A third student registered for classes 2 days later, and Wallace was nowhere to be found. As we've seen, President Kennedy has very reluctantly embraced the civil rights movement, being forced to do so by the civil rights protesters themselves. Well, in June of 1963, as the president is gearing up for re-election in 1964, he announces to the American people that he will, at last, support a comprehensive civil rights bill, one that will completely outlaw public segregation. He says on TV, "If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place?" After President Kennedy publicly commits his administration to the passing of a Civil Rights Act in 1963, the event now known as the March on Washington takes place in August. The organizers are there to pressure Congress to act. Civil rights organizers and leaders sponsored a massive March on Washington to dramatize public support for the Civil Rights Bill. Supporters include SCLC, SNCC, and the NAACP. The organizers had hoped for 100,000 people to show up. Over 200,000 showed up. They were young, they were old, they were Protestant, they were Catholic, and they were Jew. 1/4 of those in attendance were white. Now, the speakers included some of the biggest civil rights leaders of their day, such as A. Philip Randolph, John Lewis of SNCC, and Roy Wilkins, president of the NAACP. But everyone was silenced and awed when the keynote speaker finally took the stand. Well, so the question remains, did Kennedy ever sign any meaningful civil rights legislation during his administration? The answer is no. And of course, we can't really blame him for it, because he was shot and killed in Dallas shortly after the March on Washington in November. President Lyndon Johnson was then sworn in on board Air Force One with the slain President Jackie Kennedy's wife by his side. So let's take a minute to get to know President Johnson then before we proceed. Lyndon Baines Johnson was everything that the Kennedys were not. The Kennedys were from aristocratic Northern blood. They were from Massachusetts. They were Harvard educated, and they had a very wealthy and powerful father. Johnson comes from very humble roots. His dad was a farmer. He was Southern. He was from Texas, from the hill country. He was not Ivy League educated. He was educated at Texas Teachers College, where he went on to teach 5th and 6th grade in Cotulla, Texas in the 1920s and 1930s. And there Johnson experienced firsthand the poverty and discrimination of his largely Latino pupils who were forced to attend segregated schools in the hill country of Texas. Johnson enters politics in 1931, first as an aide to U.S. Congressman Richard Kleberg of Corpus Christi. And finally, Johnson decides he's going to run for Congress himself, serves out 2 terms, and then is elected as senator to represent Texas. Well, the Kennedys were skeptical of Johnson, and Johnson was skeptical of the Kennedys. In fact, Johnson had run for the nomination in 1960 and had lost it to JFK. And so the Kennedy campaign decides that they're going to put Johnson on the ticket as part of their Southern strategy, thinking he will appeal to those solid Southern voters that Kennedy is likely to lose. Now, the irony is that Kennedy is the tough, cold warrior who distanced himself from civil rights. Johnson is the New Dealer who looks up to FDR. And he is moving closer and closer to embracing a policy that is pro-civil rights. But nevertheless, when Kennedy is killed in 1963 and Johnson is sworn in as president, the Solid South breathes a sigh of relief. We have a Southern Democrat from Texas in the White House, and so everybody relax. Whatever Kennedy's moves were on civil rights, they are going to be put on the back burner. Well, Johnson surprises everybody when one of his first moves is to fully embrace the civil rights bill that JFK had promised before he was killed. He says in 1964, "No memorial, oration, or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long. We have talked long enough in this country about equal rights. We have talked for 100 years or more. It is now time to write the next chapter and to write it into the books of law." So says LBJ to the Congress in one of his first speeches as president. So this proposed Civil Rights Bill of 1964, it would prohibit discrimination in all public places on the basis of race, religion, national origin, and gender. It gave all citizens the right to enter libraries, parks, washrooms, restaurants, theaters, and all other public accommodations. Now, Johnson knows that he does not have the political capital to get this done right away. Southern congressmen waged a war on the Senate floor for 83 days. That's a filibuster in which they intend to talk a bill to death before it's passed in order to keep it from passing. This is the longest filibuster in Senate history. Can Johnson actually get this done? This is America's first experience with what becomes known as the Johnson treatment. Johnson is going to get this bill passed, and he's going to get it passed on his terms. He's going to do it by waving the bloody shirt. He's going to exploit Kennedy's death for his own political purposes. He's going to enlist the churches, showing up in the pulpits of Protestant and Catholic churches across the nation in order to campaign for this civil rights bill. In general, most churches, both Protestant and Catholic, were in favor of civil rights, and this excludes many of the churches in the South, which are not. He's also going to cash in on every political favor that is owed him. Quid pro quos. Johnson's getting on the phone personally, calling people at home, twisting arms, as he puts it. And Johnson is not afraid to intimidate. "If you get in the way," he tells one Georgia senator, "I'm going to run you down." Now, Johnson was a big man, and he was not afraid to use his physical presence as a way to intimidate congressmen and senators to do what he wanted. So here he is, getting in the face of one senator and telling him how the cow eat the cabbage. Here's Johnson meeting another congressman in the hallway, and the guy looks kind of relaxed, but at the same time, you can tell he wishes that Johnson would just get out of his face. But Johnson's going to tell him, you're going to pass this bill, or guess what? I'm going to make sure nothing happens in your home district again. In the end, the Senate voted on the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, and it passed. And you can see, where did it pass? Almost the entire North and the West. The gray states are divided, meaning one senator voted against it and one senator voted for it. And the red states, well, those are the states that voted against it. Now, there's one state that I want to point out for you. Look to the far west to Arizona. That's where you're going to meet a guy named Barry Goldwater, the Republican from Arizona who voted against the bill. And I want you to write his name down and think about it, and he's going to be a test question. The Republican Barry Goldwater voted against the Civil Rights Bill of 1964. So let's all just put that in our heads and memorize that, and we're going to come back to that in the future. Well, there is LBJ and Martin Luther King Jr. shaking hands over the final signing of the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, which was made into law on July 2nd. Not everybody's happy with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. One man is named Lester Maddox. Now, Lester Maddox is a named teak. You must know about him. Lester Maddox is a restaurant owner in Alabama who decides that he would rather close down his business than abide by the desegregation mandate of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So you can see his sign up there, closed, going out of business, resulting from an act passed by the U.S. Congress, signed by President Johnson, and inspired and supported by deadly and bloody communism. Wow, very interesting. So he's not going to abide by this. He's telling you, forget it, I'm not going to do it. And here's Lester Maddox out protesting on the streets. And let's take a look at his sign. Down with Johnson, down with socialism, down with communism, up with Wallace. He's talking about George Wallace, the guy who made his stand in front of the University of Alabama. Up with free enterprise, up with capitalism, liberty, private property rights, and of course, up with America. So Lester Maddox is associating a lot of things with President Johnson. Somehow, Johnson ended up being a socialist and a communist. And I guess free enterprise means you get to discriminate against whoever you want to. So says Lester Maddox. Well, even though we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964 signed into law, problems remain. The 15th Amendment guarantees all Americans the right to vote, but as you know, many southern states still require literacy tests and poll taxes in order to cast a ballot. CORE and SCLC are going to lead a massive voter registration campaign in the South. They recruit idealistic college kids, both black and white, and they train them in the art of nonviolent resistance in what becomes known as Freedom Summer of 1964. The volunteers, as they travel south, are harassed, arrested, and, of course, beaten by disgruntled segregationists. And the movement gains international attention when 3 civil rights workers go missing in June of 1964. The event underscores the problem and dramatizes the problem on national television as people are wondering, what is this all about? Are segregationists really willing to go so far as to kidnap and maybe even murder college kids who are just trying to get people registered to vote? Well, the FBI investigates the disappearance, and they learned that local Ku Klux Klansmen had actually murdered the men and disposed their bodies. Will the federal government now take action? Does President Johnson have the political capital to work another miracle such as what he has just done with the Civil Rights Act of 1964? Now, in fact, President Johnson does not have the political capital to work another miracle as he had with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But Martin Luther King and the SCLC want to act now. They want a Voting Rights Act before Congress, and they want Johnson's public support. Now, LBJ realizes that he has cashed in all of his political favors, and because of his support of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, he is persona non grata in the Solid South. In fact, his advisors had told him, if you do this, Johnson, you will lose the Democratic Party in the South forever. Well, this is where the film Selma is wrong. Now, I enjoyed Selma, and I enjoyed its portrayal of Martin Luther King, which I thought was spot on. But there's is where they fudged the history a little bit. You see, there was not a deep antagonism between Johnson and King. The two did not disagree on the need for a bill. They agreed there must be a voting rights bill. They disagreed, however, on how it could be passed. Johnson says, I don't have the cash to get it done right now. And Martin Luther King says, we can't wait. Well, the Selma campaign is where they're going to find their compromise. By the end of 1964, more than 2,000 black protesters had been arrested in SCLC demonstrations in the South. After a demonstrator named Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot and killed, King announced a protest march to take place from Selma to Montgomery to dramatize the need for a voting rights bill in Congress. Now, Johnson gave King his support privately, and we know this from the correspondences that Johnson scholars have made public. He urges King, however, to get the event on camera. So the Selma March begins on March 7, 1965. And it is every bit the debacle that both Johnson and Kennedy thought it would be. People are seriously injured. Skulls are cracked. People fall to the ground. There's a lot of protesting and a lot of tears. And Americans see what's happening on television. The sacrifice and determination of the protesters at Selma created within American voters that creative tension which King so wanted to see. And it gave President Johnson the political capital on which to act in Congress. And so, again, on March 15, 1965, President Johnson addresses Congress and tells them directly to act on a voting rights bill. He says, we cannot refuse to protect the right of every American to vote in every election. We cannot wait another 8 months before we get a bill. We have already waited 100 years and more, and the time for waiting is gone. So I ask you to join me in working long hours, nights and weekends if necessary, to pass this bill. And I don't make that request lightly. For from the window where I sit, the problems of our country, I recognize that outside this chamber is the outraged conscience of a nation, the grave concern of many nations, and the harsh judgment of history on our acts. But even if we pass this bill, the battle will not be over. What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement which reaches into every section and state in America. It is the effort of American Negroes to secure for themselves the full blessings of American life. Their cause must be our cause too, because it is not just Negroes, but really it is all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice, and we shall overcome. And so, Johnson, by using the language of the movement and employing it directly in his speech to Congress, succeeds in getting the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed.